This is BreakPoint This Week, a weekly briefing on faith, culture, worldview, and mission with John Stonestreet, president of the Colson Center for Christian Worldview.
Well, welcome to BreakPoint This Week. John Stonestreet here along with Shane Morris. The second to last conversation we're going to have about what's happening in the culture from a Christian worldview in 2019. And that's an easy way, Shane, to say don't miss next week, where we invite our good friend Mindy Beltz of World Magazine to join us as we talk about really what happened not just in the last week, but in the last year in 2019, and then ongoing what we can expect into 2020. It'll be a great conversation. But there's plenty to talk about this week without even looking at the whole year, huh?
Yeah, I can't think of anything to talk about this week, John. It's really been a slow news week, to be honest.
Yeah, exactly. All right, well, let's start. Let's get the elephant out of the I was going to say the elephant out of the bag.
The
but I don't think
donkey
that's actually,
as well.
This is terrible. We should just start this whole show over or issue a public apology. No, we have to talk
both
about
dads. We're both dads. It's inevitable.
Dad jokes. We have to talk about the story of the week, of course, which isn't really a surprise. You know, this has been a long time coming, which is that the House of Representatives did vote that Donald Trump would become the third U.S. president in history to be impeached, which, you know, the process goes that that's supposed to set up a trial in the Senate. Now, that's been delayed at least a little bit by Nancy Pelosi. And, you know, it's just kind of one thing after another. You know, it tells me, Shane, and this is not to justify a phone call with the Ukrainian president by our president and how that whole thing went down, whether that was a moral, immoral thing to do and so on. But it's just clear from, you know, the Democrats announcing before the inauguration that they were going to impeach the president, through the whole process, through now another kind of political ploy, that what really is something that's supposed to safeguard our democracy, a procedure that's supposed to be non-political and, you know, basically patriotic-centric. It's something you could see if you go back to the Nixon impeachment process, even though he wasn't actually officially impeached, but everything kind of heading up. You know, this is something we're going to look at this, not from a political standpoint, but for something much bigger. But here we are. I mean, this thing has been political from the very beginning. I think it's why a whole lot of people don't seem to care about it.
Yeah, like you mentioned, the outcome, if it ends up in the Senate anytime soon, is virtually inevitable. So it was best summed up by this one GIF image. And for those who are less technically savvy, a GIF is like an animated picture on social media of a printer printing out articles of impeachment. And then it fell down, and the printer was labeled House of Representatives, and it fell down into a shredder named the Senate. And it just shredded it immediately. So, yeah, that's why it wouldn't be going there as quickly. But yeah, I don't think wading into the merits of the impeachment itself, like you said, is really going to be productive right now, or even the purpose of this program. We're here to talk worldview, and I think there are deeper points to make, as you mentioned. I think about as we head into what's likely to be one of the most tumultuous political years we've ever seen. Although, come to think of it, you probably saw Andrew Johnson's impeachment proceedings, so I might.
Oh, that's terrible. Okay, millennial.
But here's the serious point, John, and I think it comes in the form of a question for me. To the Republicans listening, be honest with yourselves now. If this were a President Hillary Clinton and a Republican Congress instead of a Democratic one, and she were accused of doing the exact same sort of quid pro quo arrangement with the Ukrainian president as Trump is, would you still be calling it, I'm not assuming you are, but for those who are, would you still be calling it a witch hunt and fake news and so forth? Or would it be more like lock her up and calling it a threat to American national security? And I say that not to accuse anyone necessarily, but to illustrate the partisan divide at work here. Both sides had a foregone conclusion before this thing even began, right, John?
Well, you know, they did, and that's kind of, you know, the story of the nation is that it's, you know, basically we are completely seeing things along political lines and not moral lines. And on the flip side, you know, if you were a Democrat and the tables were turned and you looked at this and said, well, you know, what you have is, you know, this warning, this kind of imminent proceeding that was going to happen, you know, again, before the nomination even took place, that it's been clear from the very beginning that impeachment was where all this was going to land, that you've got, you know, the victim of the crime saying, you know, there was no pressure that I felt, you know, as the Ukrainian president has said repeatedly. Would you, you know, throw your hands up and say it's so obvious that, you know, he committed a crime, or would you say, you know, this is a witch hunt? And that just kind of tells us it's very, very difficult in our culture right now to get above thinking about things on any level different than just kind of seeing things politically. And the process is broken. This is not what the process was ever supposed to be used for. And the reporting on it, it's hard to actually get the news. But I think it's also, I'm not sure. I think there's an awful lot of Twitter noise. But I learned from a couple different events in the past year that loud noise on Twitter isn't the same thing as actually being relevant or actually mattering. This hasn't swayed. One of the things that is consistent, this hasn't swayed anybody's political opinions. This polling continues to tell us this. But I think there's an awful lot of Americans that just aren't paying attention. I think there was a political calculation by the Democrats that this, even if it wasn't going to work in the long term, that it was going to be a net political win for the next election, that going in, President Trump is going to have on his candidacy, he was impeached. And at least according to the polling we see now, and of course, you got two issues with polling. Number one, it can change. And number two is clearly our pollsters are not very good at getting to the truth. But I don't think you have a whole lot of Americans that are really paying attention to this. I think many people actually see it as a political football and not as something that's really trying to get to the truth.
Yeah, I think it was Matt Walsh who said on Twitter, again, that bastion of all that's relevant to Americans in general, that by mid next year, everyone's going to have forgot about this. It's not going to be a major issue in the election. So you may be right about that, John. I look at this as an illustration of something that Os Guinness talks about in a lot of his books, that our republic is not infinitely malleable, that it can't accommodate this infinite diversity of opinions. There has to be some consensus around a more moral and social truths like honesty and legitimacy of the process and legal protections for citizens' rights and all that. And the fact that a majority vote doesn't make right, So without that, the republic can't sort of continue. It won't cohere. Political groups that are simply unwilling to talk to each other or accept the legitimacy of elections or move on and get things done after the fact instead of relitigating every election or preparing for the next one, they're not going to be able to coherently work together as a government. And if you look back over the history of the United States as a whole, we've had 3 impeachments now, almost 4 because of the Nixon resignation, but we've had 3 impeachments now, and 2 of them have taken place in my lifetime. So we're like 1 for 2 at this point on impeachments in the last 30 years. It's really heating up. And I think it's a sign of something potentially underlying the political process, that there's a lack of cohesion and a coming apart in the polis itself. But yeah, the question remains, how is that going to affect the coming election? How do Americans in general feel about it? I don't know that I have the answer to that.
Well, and the question is, too, where does this go from here? I mean, the fact that you've seen 2 of these in your lifetime says a lot because you're like 12, right? So there's,
thanks, John.
You're not that old. Yeah, you threw an age joke
I
out.
did,
It's right
I
back
did.
at you.
It's fair is fair.
But, that is really one of the questions. Are we really going to do this? Are we going to start saying, this person is unfit to be president ahead of time, so we're going to plan to impeach them, and we're going to look for a justification, on the back end. Now, whether the justification is there or not for President Trump, this is the historical record. This was talked about, well before even the midterms. And is this now going to be the process where we're going to see the next president, basically be this process of impeachment be used because of the political hate that is across the aisle? You're right. Our system cannot accommodate that sort of animosity. And I don't think we're a culture that is reflecting progress in 2 other areas. I mean, I've quoted Solzhenitsyn now since 2016 over and over and over, who said that one of the signs of a decaying society is the lack of great statesmen. And gosh, if this process has, pointed out anything, is that we're a nation without great statesmen. And then, also he pointed to the decadence of art. But I think it is something, the lack of civic education is the other thing. Most people don't even know, kind of what the impeachment process is or what it's for. And now we have people actually that are in charge of the process that are using it in ways that it was never intended to be used. And so, this doesn't bode well for the future. We'll see what happens. Nancy Pelosi made a decision, at least at the time that we're recording this could change in the next 24 hours before this goes live, but that she's not going to actually pass on the articles of impeachment to the Senate, which is also a political calculation, which just kind of adds to the skepticism. It's a frustrating thing. But it also tells us, too, that ultimately the hope for the future of society is not going to come, as Chuck Colson would say, on Air Force One. It's going to come outside of that. The thing that ruins the world won't come on Air Force One, and the thing that saves the world won't come on Air Force One. That's a good reminder, especially as we head into. If there's one bright spot, I kind of woke up this morning thinking we're going to have this conversation, and this is week before going into Christmas, and this is what we're going to be talking about. It just kind of makes you angry, right? It's like I don't want to talk about this, but it is a good reminder too that we're going to remember on Wednesday of next week carries with it far more hope and far more stability for our worldview than anything else. Well, you're listening to BreakPoint this week. John Stonestreet here along with Shane Morris. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Hey, BreakPoint listeners, this is Heidi Allums, Marketing Manager at the Colson Center. In 2020, the marketing team's goal is to get BreakPoint and Colson Center content into the hearts and minds of more listeners, in addition to improving on the content that you already love. Your donations will help us reach more people with good Christian ideas. Please join me in supporting good content and good ideas. You can make your year-end gift at breakpoint.org/podcast.
Back on BreakPoint this week, John Stonestreet here along with Shane Morris. And if you enjoy the conversations that we have each and every week here, whether it's on the podcast or on the radio or wherever you catch us, and you're grateful for the clarity that comes only from a Christian worldview that you hear on BreakPoint and on the BreakPoint This Week conversations, don't forget that we can only exist because of listeners like you. And as you consider what you're going to support with year-end giving, we'd be grateful if BreakPoint were on your list. If you want to know more, just go to breakpoint.org and click the button there that says give. That's breakpoint.org. Shane, let's jump to a very interesting story that just kind of hit the news on Thursday. And what's fascinating about it is one of the things we have been talking about. I've made this statement many times on BreakPoint and in front of audiences that there is a coming war between the L and the T, and specifically between feminist and the T. And even the idea when we say things like the LGBT movement, that's, I think, a misnomer because it's not a coherent movement. There is a good bit of animosity between those letters of the acronym. And the other thing, I'll say this, it's been fascinating to watch this year about just how many people aren't woke enough. Martina Navratilova, even Pete Buttigieg is not woke enough. And if he's not woke enough, man, you don't have a chance. But J.K. Rowling clearly is not either. She has voiced support. It's a very kind of courageous thing for her to do. J.K. Rowling, who clearly is not a conservative on any level, not coming from a Christian religious point of view, has come down on the side of a UK researcher who lost her job at a think tank for saying the incredibly controversial thing that women are biological women and men cannot become biological women, and that biological sex has something to do with that. And here's what she wrote: dress however you please, call yourself whatever you like, sleep with any consenting adult who'll have you, live your best life in peace and security, but force women out of their jobs for stating that sex is real. Hashtag I stand with Maya. That's the name of the researcher who lost her job. And it's a very interesting thing that we're seeing now, kind of sides being drawn. It's happening, by the way, I think more starkly in Britain already than it is here, Shane, that divide between the L and the T, or between at least feminist and the transgender movement, it's becoming a more stark line over there. But this is an ongoing story, but the fact that it involves the author of the Harry Potter series makes it, I think, even more significant.
Yeah, this is something you and I have talked frequently about here on the program and off the air as well. I suspect, John, and I know you do as well, that we may be hitting a kind of what's been called peak trans moment, that the demands of the LGBT movement, if there is such a movement cohesively, the T in particular, are becoming so irrational and so absurd that people are beginning to recognize, even progressives are beginning to recognize, that the proverbial emperor has no clothes. It really is hard to overstate how big a deal this little tweet by J.K. Rowling is. She's not only been an outspoken progressive for many years now in almost every issue that we talk about, but she's one of the richest and most culturally influential women in the world, having written the Harry Potter books, which were some of the best-selling novels of all time. For her to come out and say this, obviously very deliberately, very boldly, it's going to be a major roadblock in the way of the transgender movement, at least on a popular level, I think. Bigger even than, say, if someone like Oprah had come out against them. And she is being deliberate here. We should note that. Earlier this year, if you remember, she actually favorited another tweet by someone who said something like what she just said now.
Right.
And there was a huge outcry from the LGBT lobby for her to renounce that, and they called her a transphobe. But she hasn't renounced it. And now she's come out with this extremely deliberate statement where she ends it up by saying, This is not a drill. So it's her way of saying, I'm serious about this. I'm really willing to go to battle, and I'm willing to put everything on the line for it. So yeah, that's huge cultural ballast. I'll be fascinated to see how this comes out.
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, listen, what's happened is that the transgender cause has hitched itself to the LGB, the rest of the acronym. And there's a bunch of differences. I mean, first of all, the L and the G really made their progress by saying born this way. And the T is basically saying the exact opposite. I was born this way and it was wrong. Not only that, but you remember the gay and lesbian movement, even the same-sex marriage, pushing that was, stay out of my bedroom. And the T is, hey, transgender story hour at your local library. In other words, it's no longer just, leave me alone and don't interfere. So it's not the same whatsoever. But of course, the key thing that's causing the problem is that we're in a moment right now of women basically saying, with the Me Too movement and other things, like, no, we are not going to abandon our ability to have our rights of human safety, rights of what it means to be a woman, and so on and so on and so on. And undergirding second wave feminism, we could say, was this idea that, women are women and men can't understand it, and women need to have their own rights. And we've kind of structured this as a man's world, and so on and so on and so on. And now what do you have is a group of men kind of claiming the rights that were won by the feminist movement. This is not something that's going to go down well. And it's only going to become a heated thing as we talk about kind of what's going on in 2020. It was also interesting, Shane, though, this week that, we've had kind of the Chick-fil-A conversation. There was another kind of player. One of the things we said when we had the Chick-fil-A conversation is, look, you could take a side in the culture war, but you can't change sides in the culture war. Like, that's right, where you're going to get in an awful lot of trouble. Seems like the Hallmark Channel changed sides twice this week. That's going to be...
There's always a lot of drama on the Hallmark Channel. I'm not surprised by it.
There is a lot of drama. By the way, I heard a great joke. I don't know if you heard this one. What has 4 actors and 1 plot? 68 movies on the Hallmark Channel.
Yeah. Even the cover art looks identical. If you've ever seen one of those mosaics of them all together. Andrew Peterson makes a joke about that, about a muscular, burly man, without a shirt, whose head is cut off on the cover, and there's a woman who's very much plain and ordinary, and you're supposed to be able to inhabit her character, leaning against him. Yeah.
Yeah, we actually did a BreakPoint earlier this year on why Hallmark Channel has so many viewers. And, I'm not a big fan of any of those films. I have some friends, that are. It's kind of a world gone by where the community cares about people and, you kind of feel at home and that sort of thing. I saw another meme that said, if I were a really busy doctor in a big city, I'd be really concerned about the single dad that lives in the small town where my girlfriend's hanging out. It's just like the same plot over and over and over. But of course, what happened was Hallmark chose to initially accept an ad which featured a lesbian couple. And then because of protests, specifically led by a group out of the American Family Association, to pull that. And then when the counter-protest from folks, particularly I think GLAAD, one of the gay and lesbian organizations in America, really pushed, they changed again. And, Hallmark, it's amazing. Most channels would kill for the sort of audience that Hallmark has around the holiday season. Now, of course, the holiday season at Hallmark starts about, October the 3rd. But there's, it's another kind of example of there's not a single area of our life that's going to go untouched. I mean, we talked about this so many different levels, Shane. Here's the thing that I want to say, I think about this is if you think you're going to be able to sit this one out, you're not going to be forced to take a side on this. There's just very, very few areas of culture left where you're not forced to kind of make your, woke stance known in one direction or another. And you're going to have to know that going in. And as Jesus said, you're going to have to count the cost going in because there's going to be a cost one way or the other.
You can't serve these two masters. And that's precisely what gives me hope in this, even if it seems a little bit misplaced in the current headlines, is that this movement is reaching so far and demanding so much and punishing everyone so hard that I wonder, are people going to get sick of it? Because I think that the LGBT movement, again, such as it is, was able to succeed to a large extent because the sell up front was, hey, just let these ladies get married. They want a family just like you. They want to live a happy middle-class life. And it was sold to us that way. The Pete Buttigieg image of a loving same-sex couple who just wants to live their life. But it's really quickly gone beyond that. The slope was slippery, John, like so many conservative observers said back in the day, that it's gone from let us live as we want to live, to now you must not only live as we want you to live, but you have to think the way we want you to think, approve of the things we want you to approve of, and God help you if you disagree. I mean, that makes me wonder, can people stomach this? Or is there going to be a backlash? And the fact that J.K. Rowling has come out now and is making a calculated stand against at least one of the letters of the acronym tells me, hey, I might be onto something.
Yeah, I think there actually has been an overselling of the movement. There's no question about it. But it also kind of, asks the question. I mean, there's this wonderful passage in the middle of Jeremiah's book where basically he says, if you can't run on foot with soldiers, how are you going to race with horses? And you kind of think, look, this is the level of competition. This is the challenge, the level of worldview competition, let's say, in our cultural moment. And if our discipleship at our churches, not to just to mention young people, what happens in too many youth group rooms, but even, what counts as discipleship in most church programs is what it is. Are we actually cultivating a generation of Christians who are going to have the courage to take those sorts of stands when, the social costs are there? The social privilege of being a Christian might still exist in, small corners here and there in the country, but by and large,
those small towns where the Hallmark Channel movies take place.
Yeah, that's right. What was once kind of social benefit is now a social liability. It's not even neutral. And it's going to be interesting to see if that sort of commitment stays. Well, we got one more thing I think we should talk about here as we head into Christmas week. You're listening to BreakPoint This Week with Shane Morris and John Stonestreet. And if you appreciate what you get from the Colson Center and BreakPoint each and every day on our daily commentaries and our weekly conversation, or from our podcasts and all the other different ways that the Colson Center seeks to bring you Christian worldview content, please consider supporting this organization, supporting this ministry with a year-end gift. Just go to breakpoint.org. Click on the link there on the homepage that says Give. Again, that's breakpoint.org. You're listening to BreakPoint This Week. We'll be right back.
Hi, I'm Brooke Colon, and I'm the Associate Director of the Colson Fellows Program. I get to work with hundreds of incredible people each year and watch them grow into amazing callings God has placed on them. Your donations make the Colson Fellows Program a reality and help scholarship people who otherwise couldn't afford to participate. Please join me in supporting these kingdom-loving leaders. Make your year-end gift at breakpoint.org/podcast.
We're back here on BreakPoint This Week. John Stonestreet here along with Shane Morris. Shane, it is officially Christmas season, even for us Advent folks who are kind of the grumpy, like you can't say Merry Christmas until Advent is over. I would put myself somewhat in that category. And by the way, Mary did know. But before I go any further on all that sort of...
Still gnawing away at that bone, are we?
Yeah,
John?
that's an important thing to fight over. No, listen, annually we kind of walk into a little bit of a landmine around Halloween when... we talk about whether, to celebrate Halloween is a Christian thing to do and all of that sort of stuff. And there is this hang up that a lot of Christians have historically had with holidays. And Christmas is one of them. And I want to have that conversation because our good friend, Dr. Glenn Sunshine, who has been a longtime faculty member in our Colson Fellows program and a longtime theological advisor to Chuck Colson and a good friend of the organization, a constant speaker for us, and writes a lot on our website, has done a terrific piece having to do with whether, Christmas trees and other Christmas traditions are pagan and whether it crosses the line for Christians to celebrate Christmas because of what many people see as pagan roots. And I know this is something you've talked about and written about as well.
Yeah, it is. There are two separate issues to talk about here, as far as I can tell, John. The first is the historical claim. So whether we're talking about, Christmas or Halloween or Easter or whatever, there are historical claims that are made by some of the, I think, well-meaning religious critics, which go along these lines, that the things you're doing, the decorations you're putting up, all harken back to some pagan celebration, and so you're unknowingly celebrating paganism. And the historical claims on all fronts, it turns out, fall apart. And Glenn takes apart some of those claims in his article. He says, for instance, that the supposed pagan roots of Christmas and then the actual traditions that we use, like the Christmas tree, for instance, are separated by such a wide gulf that there's no way there could have been cultural continuity between them. First of all, they can't really be those same traditions. The second, more important point I think we need to make is that Satan doesn't own this world. He's a usurper. And God says that he not only owns everything, but that everything he has made is good if received with thanksgiving. That's what Paul says about meat sacrificed to idols. Trees are God's creation. They're good. There's no risk, I don't think, of anyone in our culture looking at our Christmas trees and our wreaths and our eggnog and our lights and ugly sweaters and what have you, and saying, "Oh, I bet they're a Druid family. I bet they're worshiping that tree." I don't think that's, in our cultural context, a big risk. So applying Paul's situation, I don't think we're going to offend consciences in that way. But I think the larger claim we need to make is that Jesus owns it all. And as long as these traditions, as beloved as they are, aren't distracting from the celebration of Christ's birth and the incarnation and what Christmas is really all about, I don't think there's a problem with them. And I think Glenn's article makes a real good case for that.
Yeah, come to breakpoint.org, click on the link there on the homepage. That it says resources mentioned on the radio and podcast, and we'll link you to this terrific article called "Oh Christmas Tree" by Glenn Sunshine that talks about this. And, Shane, my concern going into Christmas and remembering it is not so much that, the way Christians celebrate Christmas gets confused with paganism, but that it gets confused with materialism.
Right.
And, that's the worldview battle that we face today. And doing Christmas differently. And this is, a little bit of a tightrope, I think, for Christians to walk, because we believe that Christmas is when we remember the single greatest gift that God lavishly, generously bestowed on the universe and to us as individuals. And that should spark a generosity that reflects our Creator. And yet at the same time, in the midst of wanting to kind of live this sort of generosity and be this sort of person that reflects the lavish generosity of our Creator, who expresses us through Christ, we can often, find ourselves, missing the whole point because we are such a commercially driven society, a society that instead of seeing a God-shaped hole that only God can fill, we often think we have a stuff-shaped hole that only stuff can fill. And that's the real, I think, pagan temptation of Christmas today. But Shane, it's always good to have these conversations. We'll be back again next week with our good friend Mindy Beltz to talk about the stories of 2019 and the trends going into 2020 from a Christian worldview. But between now and then, I hope you, Shane and Gabby and the kids, have a wonderful Christmas and enjoy your time. And to all of our listeners and supporters and friends of BreakPoint and the Colson Center, we want to say Merry Christmas to you as well. Merry Christmas from Shane and I. And you've been listening to BreakPoint This Week.